I'm absolutely delighted to say that the Mayor of West Midlands, Andy Street, joins me in the studio now. Andy.
Good morning,
Thank you very much for making the journey south to come and speak to us today. Look, we've got to start with this Crooked House pub.
Oh, yeah.
It's on your patch. I know you've been quite vocal about it. I appreciate that there is a police investigation being carried out, but it's been put to me by a correspondent this morning that there is something that seems a little more crooked about this than just the pub.
So we do have to respect the police inquiry, and of course the local authority also investigating, because they're the planning authority, they're the ones with the powers to act over a rebuild. But you are right, there's two underlying points here. The local people are really outraged by this. They see this as an attack on their heritage, their history, and particularly people in the Black Country are very, very proud of that. But then the other underlying point is there sufficient legal protection for buildings like this? And I think it's for those two reasons that this is becoming a story of national significance, even international significance, because people feel they're two underlying important points.
People who are watching the show were just showing some images of this pub being burnt out. That was before it was razed to the ground with a digger that apparently had been booked before the pub even burnt down. If you're listening on the radio, we're just seeing images of the burnt out shell of this building, and then lo and behold, it's then razed to the ground, seemingly without anyone being able to stop it. I've read reports about the pathway or the road to the pub being blocked by huge mounds of soil. Something seems extremely fishy about the entire thing. I think from the public's perspective, they're asking themselves two questions. First of all, how on earth is this able to happen? How could those diggers have got in and done this without seemingly anyone's permission? Point one, Andy. And point two, what legal redress does anyone locally have?
Yeah.
You've talked about this pub being rebuilt brick by brick. How can you enforce that?
Yeah, OK, so they are the points, you're right. So what is a statement of fact is that there was no permission to demolish this pub. Very clear. Permission has to be given by the local authority for a demolition to occur. That permission was not given. So, in a sense, that's an established fact. We've got to then follow through the consequences of that. Now, when I say the pub must be rebuilt brick by brick, clearly that's the local requirement, but there are also precedents for that in law. There's a wonderful story of a pub in Maida Vale in London, the Carlton Tavern, that was knocked down without permission, was rebuilt brick by brick. Of course, it's going to be rather more difficult with a very quirky building like this, but that's the ambition, because it's almost like a principle that we cannot see heritage erased in this way.
I mean, when you talk about it being rebuilt, are you saying exactly in the form that it was before? Because obviously it was crooked as a result of subsidence. It would have to be built in a very unique and perhaps peculiar way to recreate the magic. But is that what your vision is for this?
Well, this is going to be very hard, isn't it? And we're perhaps a little further through the story
but
here.
Just ideally, because I know this is what the people want.
It is indeed, and then ideally that should be so. But we've got to just face reality. It's going to be rather challenging to get exactly the quirkiness. But the mission that we set out with, and the local authority who have the power to demand this, are in exactly the same place. I've had discussions with them this week. That is what we're setting out to do, because it matters as a precedent, a principle.
And what about the owners then? It's difficult, this, isn't it? It's sold by the Marston Brewery to private individuals. We don't quite know what their involvement is with any of this. As you say, it's being investigated by the police. The police are also looking at a potential arson case, so it's quite complicated. But can they be forced to have to rebuild the pub on their own land that they own, because it's a diktat from somebody in central government or some other body? Can that actually happen? Is it feasible, this, Andy?
So we are, of course, just going through the detail of the law, and it's why it's so interesting. What's the power in the law? But my understanding is that the local authority have the power to enforce that. But that's just been worked through, and we must give time for the local authority to actually do their investigation and determine that, because this is quite technical legal stuff. But that is my hope. To be clear as well, another point, Marston sold that pub very legally, fine. So there is an underlying point to the citizens watching, thinking this is terrible. Support your local pubs as well. This is an obvious point. They sold it because it wasn't trading well. It's a hard thing to acknowledge, but it's true. So let's support these heritage buildings.
What can the good people of Dudley do to help you to ensure, because you seem very determined that this pub is going to be rebuilt?
So I'm very determined because of what the good people of Dudley have said, actually. So I would say to anyone watching from Dudley, or indeed the other local areas, your voice has been heard. you've done something really powerful this week. You've said, this is our history. We're going to defend our history. We're proud black country people. We know of our history.
Yes.
They've done that. Now they have to leave the local authority and the police force and the fire service to do their investigations. And I know patience is a hard thing to ask for, but it is what's required.
We need it in this case. Thank you very much on all of that, Andy. Let's move to the West Midlands then and tell me, how are things going? Obviously, we've got the government's levelling up agenda. Are the government levelling up places like the West Midlands? I know you've been a bit critical of this kind of begging bowl culture around some of the funding.
Yeah.
What's the situation for you?
So it's moved on since that. That was back in about March when I was critical of the begging bowl culture, as I called it, and the idea there was a small pots of money allocated by government through the Levelling Up Fund, and I didn't believe that was the best way of achieving investment into the West Midlands or indeed anywhere else. But actually, there's been a big move since then, and it sounds a bit technical, but the government have now agreed a devolution deal with ourselves and Greater Manchester, a third deal. And in that, they actually moved to transferring large amounts of cash and power and decision-making.
Enough
and the principle, there's never enough, is there? But there's a large amount. But the principle is that we take the decisions locally about how we're going to spend that. They call it a single pot. So we take those trade-off decisions and make sure all of our energies around skills, transport, housing, they can sort of be coordinated locally. And that's a big breakthrough, because if we're deciding rather than asking for little bits from government, hopefully we can get a plan together.
Do you think that the country is being levelled up? Obviously, in the past, we've heard a lot about north-south divides. Not just north-south divides, maybe divides between prosperous cities, even in the north, and left-behind towns, particularly seaside towns. What do you think the picture is, Andy? Because I think there are people in the north, particularly following the fall of Boris Johnson, people who voted for Brexit who don't think that the government has delivered on those promises, the so-called red wall. There are people in those constituencies feeling really, really disillusioned. They feel politically lost.
So because this isn't just a north issue, this applies to the Midlands as well. And as you say, there are places in the south that would be described as, by some, as left behind. So it's not just a north issue. Our evidence of this is that pre-pandemic, we were doing very well. We were closing that gap. But actually, the pandemic has pushed our performance backwards, so it makes this agenda even more important. And actually what you see, because you talk about Boris, but what this government under Rishi and Jeremy Hunt have done, they are investing billions in areas outside of the southeast. If I look at our experience, £1 billion for transport investments, huge money for developing skills, huge amount of money. Now, recent deal, £500 million more for building affordable homes. So the cash is being put on the table by the government, and what people on the ground want to see is actual delivery.
Now, you say that, and maybe when you talk about, big cheques being written for infrastructure and other projects, for regeneration projects, that's great. But let's be honest, and I ask you also with your former John Lewis hat on, the high street is suffering. We've heard this week that Wilko's,
as it now is,
people will like to refer to it, is in administration, it's closing down. We've also had Nigel Farage's campaign about the banks on this channel revealing that 1,000 bank accounts a day are being closed, that we're moving towards this cashless society that is closing out smaller businesses that deal in cash. I mean, you know as well as I do, because you must go shopping, boarded out high streets, inability to park where you want, LTNs and ULEZ making life difficult for the motorist. It's not contributing to, I would say, an aspirational sort of British town centre, is it?
No, it's very challenging at town centres, but
the government should be doing more to help people, shouldn't they?
But they are already...
Well, small businesses, though, Andy, I think small businesses complain that they're not giving the support they need. I recall that you actually made a complaint about small businesses perhaps not being given as much help with their energy bills as householders.
That's true. So this issue still continues. So let's be fair to the government, first of all. The support for domestic energy users has been incredible, actually. But if you look at business support, I was vociferous earlier in the year saying those who ended up with a high charge because of what happened at the end of last year, they're sort of locked into that. Now, a lot of work has been done. I've spoken personally with all of the energy companies about actually this sort of extending the contracts to enable people to bring the short-term price down and extend. But there are still some who are left with the high costs from last year. And I would like to see, straight answer, I would like to see more action action on that, because that continues to be, particularly for hospitality businesses,
Yes.
that's very challenging.
What kind of action, though? I mean, I suppose one way to look at it would be that the corporation tax hike was a mistake. It's clobbered small businesses and it should be reversed.
Yeah. So I would like to see the fund that's already been put on the table, £5 billion from the government for energy support for businesses at the moment, to be much more targeted. Not a little bit off everybody, but those who've got a real hike left beached by last year's arrangements, much more focus on those who really, really need
and
it.
Business rate relief and corporation tax
I've
relief?
always believed that business rates are very, very challenging, and I would like to see a complete reform of business rates, because if you look at what's happening, the high street is paying disproportionately business rates, and other new forms of business probably pay a lot less. So there's a really big long-term issue there. Corporation tax, I would like to see it come down over time, but let's be honest, the government has got to manage its finances as well.
What would you like to see corporation tax be? Because we had somebody on the show last week saying, John Redwood, in fact, OK, Keith Thatcherite, but at the same time he said it should be 12.5% to match Ireland.
We were at about 19%. That was very competitive within the G7.
Like it
if we
back
could
at
get back to that very competitive position, and the government has been really clear. They want to get back to that when the public finances allow. And we can't deny that we're in a particularly difficult position, and good, sound finance is a Conservative principle.
One final question. The Commonwealth Games and the future
Yes.
of the Commonwealth Games is in jeopardy because Victoria have pulled out. We now hear that Alberta in Canada can't host 2030. Could Birmingham step in and save the day?
So the interesting phrase, the word in that question is could. Of course we could. A brilliant job was done across Birmingham and the West Midlands last year, and we've seen all the figures around inward investment, the brand of Birmingham around the world being enhanced by it.
So you'd like to host it?
The question is, should we? Should we?
Should you?
And my answer to that at the moment is no. Because what the Commonwealth Games needs for its long-term success is for an Australian state to step forward, a Canadian state to step forward, and it wouldn't be quite the same if it was just in one location. Much as we, in a sense, would love to do it again, it's not yet the right answer.
Andy Street, lovely to see you this morning.
Thank you.
Give our love to the West Midlands when you return. Thank you very much for your time.